All right, then thank you very, very much for everybody who has joined us so far and who is also still joining. 43 people in this Zoom call, that's quite an impressive number, and we're really happy you joined us all for this lecture on this very interesting topic. In case you haven't been at any of our lectures before, we're the Dutch United Nations Student Association SIB-Groningen, and on a weekly basis we organize lectures, debates, or symposia about topics related to global affairs. And yeah, today is one of them because we will be talking about language and identity and how being confronted with different languages that are not our own can shape kind of our perception of ourselves. And for that, we will be joined by Dr. Sjoerd-Jeroen Moenander. He's an assistant professor at the program Minorities and Multilingualism at the University of Groningen. He also teaches at the Honors College of the University of Groningen, and his research mainly specializes in literature and the philosophy of art. So yeah, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Moenander.
Thank you very much. And I have to correct myself basically here, because I know that in some of my biographies it still says that I specialize in literature and the philosophy of art, but that's slightly outdated. My research nowadays is mostly on linguistic and cultural diversity in different settings. And that is, of course, because I now teach at the Minorities and Multilingualism program. So what I'm really interested in my research and also in my teaching is diversity and how societies in which there are one or more, most of the time, several minorities, how they relate themselves to the majority culture of that society, but also vice versa, how the majority culture develops itself and is developed in the encounter with minority cultures. So diversity is one of my main interests, and the encounter between different cultures and different ways of being in the world, because that's one way in which you would describe belonging to a culture. You belong to a certain way of being in the world, how those encounters shape our identities, and how, especially in artworks, but also in different other cultural practices, such as, for instance, cultural heritage, sports, but also television programs, things like that, how that encounter takes place, but also how people use, for instance, artworks to think about what it means to belong to a certain culture, to speak a certain language that is different from the language that other people speak and the culture that other people belong to. So how do we relate to other people's languages and other people's cultures? And that's also what I will be talking about today during this online lecture. Thank you very much, SIB, for inviting me. I was quite pleasantly surprised when I received your invitation, and I'm quite eager to give this lecture here today. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so diversity. And let me start with that, because that's where it begins. So if we talk about, okay, we're confronted with people who have a different culture, we're confronted with people who speak a different language, we are confronted with cultural / linguistic diversity. What do we mean when we say a place is diverse? For instance, when we say Groningen is a diverse city, what do we actually mean when we use this term? Well, one way to define diverse is that you're dealing with a place, a space, in which people perceive reality in different ways. Let me see if I can go to the next slide. Doesn't seem to happen. So I'm going to ask you, can you go to the next slide for me, please? Because it worked well when we tried it out, but it's not working out. Okay, so it's important to remember that we do not perceive reality without also interpreting reality. So we do not perceive the world as it is we perceive the world as we think that it is. We don't see things, we see meanings. If I go outside my house now, I'm here where I live. If I would leave the front door, if I would look around me, I would see houses, I would see cars, but I don't just see houses and cars. I see what they mean to me. I might see a nice car and I think, oh, it's a very nice car. The person who owns that car is probably quite rich. Or I might think to myself, all these environments, all these cars are bad for the environment. I wish they weren't there, or they spoil my view. All of these are meanings that I need to give to the things that I see around me. And that's how we make sense of the world around us. We would go crazy actually if we would see things rather than meanings, because then every time we see something, we would have to learn again what it is, and that's actually not what we do. That's not how we perceive. So this is how we make sense of the world. If I can't do that anymore, of course, but I live in Scheveningen and I work in Groningen. I would travel to Groningen by train, which obviously is not a possibility at the moment, which is why I'm doing this online. But if I would go and enter a train, I would see places where I could sit down, and I don't have to learn that those are chairs that I can sit down on. I can just go into the train and sit down, and then so after I see something, after I give meaning to it, I behave accordingly. And I think it's very important to remember this, because when we encounter people who belong to different cultures, they might behave differently while perceiving the same thing. And then you can actually ask yourself, are they actually perceiving the same thing? So say that most of my audience, I think today here, consists of students. Say that you would go into, again, something that is not possible these days, but hopefully soon again, you would go into a classroom and you would look around you, you would see tables. You would know that as a student you're supposed to sit down rather than stand in front of the classroom, because that's what I as a lecturer would do if I would enter that classroom. So again, your behavior follows the meaning that you give to the things that you see, and therefore I would say again, you don't see things, you see meanings. But that behavior again might be very different if you belong to a different culture. So say that you're I've been a lecturer in Tunisia, and this is one of those moments when I became really aware of that people don't see the same thing as other people if they belong to different cultures. Because before that, I taught in the Netherlands. And if a Dutch student enters a classroom and they see their lecturer, they see somebody that they are going to have maybe an interesting discussion with. And that's what they see when they see a lecturer. Whereas if a Tunisian student, I discovered when I was teaching in Tunisia, sees a lecturer, they see a source of information. And that information must be listened to very carefully, because it will have to be reproduced ad verbum during an exam. So literally what the lecturer says has to be reproduced during the exam. So what they see is actually not the same thing. They see the same person, me, but at the same time, I would argue that they don't see the same thing, because they will behave also very differently towards what they see. And here there's a short sidestep that I want to make to cognitive science, because what I'm talking about here in cognitive science is called a schema. A schema that we have in our minds, that we use to interpret reality, and that we use to organize adequate behavior in response to what we perceive. And the schemata will help us to make assumptions about what basically came before and after what we see. So if we see something, if we see, for instance, a classroom with chairs, we know that somebody made those chairs once upon a time. Those chairs were probably then produced in a factory. They were brought to the classroom. They were organized in a certain way. And all of that kind of is something that we immediately conclude after seeing something. And it's the schemata in our minds that help us to do so. Now, schemata can, of course, be very personal. It's very important to remember also, for those of you who have ever been in a love relationship, you will probably agree with me that one person will never have the same schemata as another. But we can also say that the more similar the schemata that we have are, the easier it becomes, of course, to communicate. And people who have more or less the same schemata can be said to form a culture together. So we can also define diversity, which is, I'm still trying to define it. We can also define diversity as a situation where there are people with more or less divergent schemata sharing the same space. And then we say that that space is a diverse space. Seen like this, of course, we can also understand why diversity is sometimes framed as a problem, because we can look at diversity as something that hinders communication, something that makes communication difficult, or at least as something that we have to be aware of, so that when we meet somebody from a different cultural background, we are aware of the fact that they might see different things than we think we see. They might see different meanings in that sense. Because you could also say, when schemata don't overlap, we are not talking about the same reality. That's an extreme way of phrasing it. A lot of people would disagree with me, but for the sake of argument, let's put it like that. When you look at the world, when you perceive the world through different schemata, you're not actually perceiving the same world. So that's cultural diversity. That's the first type of diversity that in our program, Minorities and Multilingualism, and in my research, I do research on and I deal with. Then the second type of diversity, I'm still not getting to the next slide. So can you go to the next slide for me, please? Thank you very much. Second type of diversity then would be linguistic diversity. And linguistic diversity, different languages, doesn't mean linguistic diversity is not always only there when people speak different languages. People might speak the same language, but the way that they use the same language might be so different that you could still speak of linguistic diversity, because we might not be talking about reality in the same codes, because that's what language is. It's a code system that we use to communicate with each other about reality. And again, that might be the case in the case of the different languages, but it might also be the case. One example that I can give, for instance, is if you go to Singapore. I don't know if there are any people from Singapore here, but correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I saw in Singapore, is that, for instance, you go to a restaurant in Singapore and a waiter might say to you, what's your drink, Lam? And for a British person, and this might sound very rude, because that's not how a waiter is supposed to communicate with a patron. So linguistic diversity is a situation like that, where people speak different languages. That's of course a very obvious example of linguistic diversity, but also where people use languages in such divergent ways that, again, you might have a communication breakdown, because somebody might be offended by something that you say, whereas it's not meant to be offended at all. So we can define in that sense diversity as a situation when two or more persons come together who have different ways of either interpreting reality or communicating about reality. So cultural diversity, when you interpret reality in different ways. Linguistic diversity, when you communicate about reality in different ways. And of course, you can't really separate these two types of diversity so easily. You will find that they're often very strongly intertwined. Again, phrased negatively, you could say that people who come from diverse backgrounds live in different worlds, because they speak about the world in different sign codes and they interpret reality, they see reality through different schemata, which again, as I said before, may lead to communication breakdowns. So on the one hand, that's I think a given. It's what you see around you every day. We live in very diverse societies. We live in very globalized societies where we're constantly confronted with people who look at the world in different ways, who speak about the world in different ways, and this may lead to communication breakdowns. But that's phrasing it as a problem. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to do in my own work, and that we're strongly also trying to do in this program where I teach minorities and multilingualism, is to also see it as something that might be fruitful, something that might help you to rethink who you are, to rethink your own culture, and to rethink your own language. And I think the audience that I'm speaking to today, the SIB members and aficionados, maybe I'm wrong, but I assume that many of you come from different cultural backgrounds. You maybe not all of you come from the Netherlands, and you might be able to confirm what I'm saying is that only when you go abroad you become aware of your own identity and who you are. It's a bit of an old chestnut, of course, but to say, I mean, my nationality is Dutch. I grew up in the Netherlands, and I only became aware of how Dutch I am when I spent a year abroad as an exchange student. And I think that goes for many of us. It's the confrontation with being different that also makes us aware of ourselves. And the remainder of this lecture, I want to explore this fruitfulness of this encounter with different ways of talking about reality, different languages, and different ways of interpreting reality, different cultures. And I will do so by discussing a few artworks that do exactly that. They explore the fruitfulness of being different, of speaking different languages, of belonging to different cultures. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here's a question. What does this mean? Can I make it a bit interactive? Is it possible to have people to react through chats?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Or you can also just answer via video link or just whatever you like. But I'm going to ask you what this means. And I'm also going to explicitly ask people who actually know what it means not to answer. So that's basically saying those of you who speak, those among you who speak Arabic, who can read the Arabic alphabet, I'm going to ask you not, okay, so Eid Mubarak. that's a nice one, Eid Mubarak. Anyone else? Then let me rephrase this question a little bit. What does it mean to you? What do you see when you see this? Text of some kind, might be nonsense, might be a message. Okay, but imagine that you're a Dutch person, which for some of you might be very difficult to imagine, but I'm still going to ask you to imagine that. Imagine you're a Dutch person and that you're walking down the street in Groningen, which during the current lockdown might be another really difficult thing for you to imagine, but still. So Arabic letters. Okay, so you see Arabic letters, and what do those letters mean to you? It definitely brings up ideas about Arabic countries, Arabic culture. Very good. Anything more? Just Arabic culture, or anything more than that? Somebody said Eid Mubarak, which of course is a religious greeting. Warm spices, food, good food. I would probably tie it to Islam. Yeah, I think that's actually fair to say. I think that's what a lot of, if you say, imagine you're an average Dutch person and you're walking down in 2020, you're walking down the street, bearded man, very nice, desert, warm weather, something with a number 3 in it. That's the one sign. That's funny. Yes. Right to left. Good one. So, but I think somebody said, well, I'd probably tie it to Islam, and I think that's actually what a lot of people, of course, would do. Tied to Islam. I've sometimes shown it to people, and they would immediately think of things like fundamentalism. Here we have conflict. Somebody says, so I would think of conflict when I see that. Thank you for being so honest, because I think that's actually true for a lot of Western people. They would see this and they would have immediately, like I said, either religious connotations or quite negative connotations about conflict, about the war on terror and things like that. My point here, of course, being that even if you don't, even if you don't read the Arabic alphabet, this sign will still have meaning for you. And actually, I would say, as somebody says, beautiful style of lettering languages. That's true. I would say that the Arabic alphabet is actually a very beautiful alphabet. So, would you see this? And I would say, actually, when you don't know what it means, it will start to have more and more meaning to you. And that's actually very interesting, right? A sign that you don't understand will start to have more meaning to you than a sign that you actually understand. Because, and can we go to the next slide, please?
Yes, we can. Next one.
Yeah, so this one. Yes, no, with the Dutch translation underneath it. Yeah, because it actually just means this, Gerard Douwstra. And if you would walk down the street, and especially if you were a Dutch person, of course, if you would walk down the street in Groningen, you would see Gerard Douwstraat, you would hardly notice it, unless you're looking for the Gerard Douwstraat, or Gerard Douwstraat means, oh, I have to go right here. But it's something that you would hardly notice, and that you would hardly project any meaning to, and especially not as much as you would project to the Arabic sign. And the point that I'm trying to make is that only when you see a sign like this, you become aware of the fact that normally you would expect to see the Latin alphabet in the street in Groningen. And the effect is quite similar too. And then we can go to the next slide, please. If somebody from continental Europe, from mainland Europe, would get into a car, and it would be this car, they would suddenly realize that normally the steering wheel would be on the other side. So you would have this idea, the steering wheel is on the wrong side. Of course, there is no right or wrong side for the steering wheel to be at. But if you are a native of continental Europe, you would definitely have this kind of sudden realization of, oh, that's not where the steering wheel should be. So by being confronted with the steering wheel being on the, between quotation marks, wrong side, you become aware of something that you normally wouldn't even give a second thought, something that you would normally not even register, i.e. that the steering wheel in countries like the Netherlands is supposed to be on the left side. Now, for somebody like me, who studies that encounter between minority and majority cultures, this is a very interesting cognitive process, and it's very interesting to be aware of this, that in the same way as with steering wheels or the Arabic alphabet, the majority culture can become normalized. So the culture of a majority in a country, in the Netherlands that would be what we call the Dutch majority, becomes normalized to the point that we become most aware of it when you are exposed to different cultures, to minority cultures. So it's actually the minority culture that makes us aware of the fact that the majority culture is not normal to everybody, that there are different ways of being than there are in the majority culture. However, if you are not familiar with that minority culture, any expression of that culture or any expression of that language is like an empty movie screen on which you can project any movie that you might have in your mind about that language. So maybe you've had this where you were listening to some people, and this is a stereotype, so forgive me, but from a Mediterranean country talking to each other, and you think, oh, they're arguing, they're on the brink of having a fight, and then later on you hear that they were just chatting about their favorite pop record. So because you don't understand the language and the gestures are not meaningful to you, or not as meaningful to you as they would be if you belong to the same culture, you project a meaning on it, and that meaning is maybe, oh, they're almost fighting. So if you're not familiar with the minority culture, the signs that belong to that culture, the language, the culture itself becomes like an empty movie screen on which you could project any meaning. And I think some of the people who were really honest about what they saw when they saw that Arabic sign, I think they gave good examples of how that happens. Now, can we go to the next slide? The fact that we project meaning on expressions of cultures that we don't understand, and that those meanings might differ, explains why we can have, if you look at these three signs, the one on the left, Chinatown in The Hague, and then you have one in Friesland. Those are quite, I mean, nobody would really, I mean, you would notice, but you would not give it much thought, I would say. But the one on the right in Arabic is impossible. Actually, it's made by an artist, whereas the other two are put there by official official authorities. So in The Hague, they decided to have, the municipality decided to have, because it's Chinatown, to have Chinese signs on the street name, the street sign. And the one in Friesland is because Friesland is bilingual and some signs are in Frisian. But the one on the right was put there by an artist who actually wanted to question it. Why is it fully and completely possible to have Chinese signs in Chinatown, but in the neighborhood, the Pijp, where a lot of Moroccan people are living, coming from a country where the Arabic alphabet is used, it would be impossible to put an Arabic sign, because those of you who are familiar with the Netherlands and the recent history of the Netherlands would know that there are certain political parties who would raise hell if the municipality of Amsterdam would decide to put up Arabic street names in the Pijp. And I think we all, I mean, those of us familiar with Dutch culture would immediately kind of sense, yes, that would not be possible. And also the answer to the question, why would it not be possible, is quite easy. Because of those meanings that people would immediately project on an Arabic sign in a Dutch street. Can we go to the next slide, please? And here's another example, the 2018 municipal elections in The Hague, in Chinatown again, where the Christian Democratic Appel, the candidate from the Christian Democratic Appel, one of the big mainstream parties in the Netherlands, appealed to Chinese voters, or voters who would at least read Chinese, so probably people with a Chinese background, to vote for him by putting up election posters all around Chinatown in Chinese. Now, again, think of the riots that would happen, the political riots that would happen if a Moroccan candidate decided to put up posters with Arabic, with the Arabic alphabet and Arabic words on the poster. They would immediately, certain politicians would immediately attack. And I don't think there's any big Dutch political party who would dare to do that. And it's, again, I mean, you can say why, but it's quite obvious why. Because indeed, we have these connotations of conflict, Islam, not possible to merge with Western culture, opposite of Western culture, all of that, in that we immediately tie to the Arabic alphabet. Can we go to the next slide, please? So there was this artwork by Jonas Staal and Vincent van Gerven-Oei, who in the night removed the Dutch street sign and put up an Arabic sign saying Gerardouwstraat. And I want to talk in the remainder of this lecture, I want to look at a few more artworks. For instance, the next slide. This is a very Dutch sign. I think everybody who spent time in the Netherlands knows this sign. It's omnipresent. Albert Heijn, I think it was, you had the supermarket wars in the 90s. You can look this up, it's very interesting history. And Albert Heijn was the winner of the supermarket wars in the 90s, resulting in far less diversity in supermarkets that you would have when I was a child, when I was young. And that's one of the reasons why this sign has become such a Dutch sign, because the sign you will see in every Dutch neighborhood that's big enough to have a supermarket. So it's everywhere. So you could say it's a very, very Dutch sign because you see it everywhere in the Netherlands. Now the funny thing is, and I don't know if there's anybody here who can read Arabic, the Arabic alphabet, but if you turn the Albert Heijn sign upside down, so like they did in the next slide, can we go to the next slide? Turn it upside down and add a little bit, but basically just repeat it. It actually says, is there anyone who knows what it says here? That word on the right. Is there anybody who reads Arabic or recognizes it from the travels? Yeah, Allah. It says Allah, which is of course the Arab word for God, the God actually, but also the word that is used in Islam to denote the supreme being, the God, same God as in Christianity and Judaism, of course. But Allah is the name that is given to God, and because Islam is such a strictly monotheistic religion, I think what happens here is actually really interesting, because quintessentially Dutch sign is turned into the quintessential Islamic sign in Arabic writing. And this was not just a visual joke. What they did then, next slide please, is they created a mosaic out of that, and there was a former supermarket, a supermarket that was empty because they lost that supermarket war that I just talked about, and they decorated it with this mosaic, and then they flew in an imam from Egypt, from the Al Azhar University, and I don't know if there's anybody here who's familiar with the Muslim world, but Al Azhar is one of the most prestigious and authoritative institutions in the Sunni Islamic world. And they flew in an imam from the Al Azhar Mosque, who during the Ramadan of 2001 led the prayers in this supermarket mosque. And they called this artwork the Albert Heijn Mosque. So it was both a functioning mosque and an artwork. And I think, again, what is very interesting here is that I think this artwork asks very interesting questions about what does it mean to be Dutch, and how compatible are Dutch culture and Muslim culture. Of course, it's a visual pun on the one hand, but I mean, consider the time, 2001. Ramadan 2001 took place a few months only after the attacks of the 11th of September 2001 in New York on the World Trade Center, which arguably changed geopolitical balance in the world, and really had long-lasting effects on the relationship between the Western world and the Muslim world, and the attitude of people living in Western countries towards their Muslim neighborhoods. So an artwork like this really asks that question. Okay, what is Dutch? If we go to the next, we can go to the next one. There's another example from 2007, another very Dutch sign, Hema. I mean, so Dutch that the Dutch flag is actually there. It's the red, white, and blue of the Dutch flag. You could say that there's hardly any store that you could imagine that's more Dutch than the Hema. Maybe the Dutch people would agree with me, but I definitely feel that this is a very Dutch store. And again, what they did is they turned this very Dutch store into an Arabic/Muslim store. Slightly different, of course, from the previous artwork where they turned it into a mosque. But what they did in this artwork in 2007 is Mediamatic, a very interesting art collective, or media collective, I would say, in Amsterdam. They invited a group of Western and Arabic artists to translate the Hema as a store into an Arabic store. Not just a sign, but if we go to the next slide, also the store itself. So you could actually go there, you could buy products such as halal smoked sausage, rather than the sausages that you, I mean, that's one of the things that people immediately associate with the Hema. You go there to buy these sausages. But also things like t-shirts, kind of, you know, basic stuff that everybody needs, which is why it's such a Dutch store, because I would argue that you can go into any Dutch house and you will find products from the Hema there. And what they did is they translated it into either Arabic, so you could buy wine. One of the things that you can buy in Hema always is wine. You can buy wine from Arabic countries, but also t-shirts with the Arabic El Hema logo, halal smoked sausages, condoms with Arab prints on it, rain chadors, so kind of veils that would also protect you against the rain, rather than the raincoats that you would normally. I mean, as a Dutch person, I would say, where do you go to buy a raincoat? Well, you go to the Hema. But now you can also buy rain shoes. This is, again, I would say, more than just a visual pun. Because one of the quintessential experiences of a minority, if you belong to a minority, is that if you belong to a majority and you want to make food for the evening, and you make the food that you grew up eating, you can go to the supermarket and buy all the ingredients that you need. But if you belong to a minority, then that's not such a given. There's a big chance that you will go to the supermarket and you'll have some difficulties finding the ingredients that you need for your cuisine, that you need for your way of being, your culture. We'll kind of, you know, think this is something that we also all know. If we've lived in a country for a while, that you go to the store and you expect to be able to buy something that in your own country you would definitely be able to buy in the supermarket or in a store like Hema, where you buy the Hema, where you buy the basics, and you can't find it. You have to go to these specialized stores that import stuff from your own country to actually find those things. So on the one hand, yes, it's a funny joke. It's actually quite, especially if you're familiar with the Hema, it's quite funny to see all of this. But I think there's a deeper level to this. And it's also interesting to know that the Hema first sued Mediamatic. They didn't want their logo to be used in it. And then they realized that that would give them bad publicity, so they kind of embraced it, and they even took over some of the products that the Hema developed. And in that sense, something foreign maybe became something more typically Dutch. Final artwork that I want to discuss is, if we can go to the next slide, is another artwork by Mediamatic, or art exhibition by Mediamatic, called Noord. It's the same trick that we saw at the beginning of this lecture. So what they did is they put Arabic signs in unexpected places, such as a Dutch magazine, or just on a Dutch street, people were suddenly confronted with these Arabic signs. And again, I would say there's this cognitive effect that you would have as a Dutch person walking down the street, suddenly seeing an Arabic sign, or leafing through a magazine and suddenly be confronted with this alphabet, which makes you aware of the fact, the alphabet that I always expect is not the only alphabet. So the normalized experience becomes a little bit of a strange experience, if you like. And this exhibition was about Amsterdam Noord, and they said Amsterdam Noord is the most Dutch of all neighborhoods. It's quintessentially Dutch. So if you go and visit the Netherlands, basically the only thing you need to do is to visit Noord, because then you've seen everything there is to see in the Netherlands. And they invited a group of Arabic and Dutch artists to stay in Noord for a while and to make artworks about what it means to live in Amsterdam Noord. Can we go to the next slide? And then they wrote what they called the first Arab language travel guide to the Netherlands. But it's not a travel guide to the entire Netherlands, it's just a travel guide to Amsterdam Noord, because that's the only part of the Netherlands that you need to see if you want to see the Netherlands as it is. And this travel guide was written in Arabic, but it had an English translation. So that, I would argue that the audience they had in mind wasn't necessarily the Arabic tourist, but they used the eyes of the fictional Arabic tourist to let people look at their own culture in a different way, as something, because it has all these languages. It's very nice and exotic, and it's all very strange and authentic. The kind of language that you would normally use to talk about, to speak about non-Western cultures, right? We all know these guidebooks to countries like Egypt, India, Indonesia, speaking about, you have to go to that village to see the real authentic Indonesia, and it's all very exotic, and they have these typical traditions that tell us something about the country. And here, that gaze that normally goes from a Western country to a non-Western country, looking for authenticity, looking for interesting exotic experiences, that tourist gaze, as it is sometimes called, is turned around, and now people are invited to look with the same gaze at their own culture. So I think that it was a very interesting exhibition. And then what they saw, everything they saw in Amsterdam Noord was presented as you would do in a travel guide to a country like Egypt, as typically Dutch, authentically Dutch. So we see bitterballen, for instance. I don't know if you know bitterballen, but the Dutch people here would say, yes, it's very authentic Dutch. But there's also a kebab store. That's the picture on the lower left. A kebab store, which is also presented as a typically Dutch tradition to go to eat kebab. Of course, kebab originally came from Turkey. There's a garden gnome, and I think a lot of us would say, oh yeah, that's typical Dutch kneuterigheid, kind of this Dutchness that is a bit kitsch. But also a Coptic church, that's the picture on the lower right. And the Coptic church is presented as typically Dutch, as traditionally Dutch, as the garden gnome. The Coptic church, Coptic Christianity is a form of Christianity that belongs to a minority in Egypt, so it's an Arab Christianity. And then apparently in Noord you have the largest congregation of Coptic Christians in Europe. So it's very North, actually, this Coptic church. But it's presented also as very typically Dutch. And I would say that this artwork or exhibition, again, asks these questions as, what is typically Dutch? And in 2010, when this exhibition was made, shouldn't we broaden typically Dutch to include also these minorities that live in North? And I think it's very interesting, both as a Dutch person and as a non-Dutch person, to go to an exhibition like this and to be asked those questions through presenting different languages, to the presentation of different cultures, kind of inviting people to broaden also their idea of what is typically Dutch a little bit, and maybe be a bit more inclusive in what they mean when they say this is very Dutch. I think I've come to the end of my short presentation. You asked me to present for about 30 minutes. Sorry, I went a little bit over that, but thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to discussing some of this and maybe answer some questions if there are any, or people who strongly disagree with me would also be very interesting.
Yes, thank you very, very much for presenting this very, very interesting topic. Yeah, we can maybe give a round of virtual applause. And thank you also for being able to join us on such a short notice indeed. And we do have room now for some questions. So if you're watching us on the live stream, feel free to just write the questions in the comments, and then we'll pass them on to here, and we'll hopefully get an answer to them. And if you're here in the Zoom call, feel free to just virtually raise your hand. So if you click on participants at the bottom of your screen, you can, there are 3 little dots in the bottom right hand corner, and one of the options you get then is to raise your hand. So please do that, or just write your questions in the chat. That also works. And I see that Alan has raised his hand.
Yeah, ask because we've seen that a lot of positive examples. Do you think that it can be also the other way around? Like, especially, we know about the positive part, like but like in art and examples of where this is qualified.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat your question because at certain times I couldn't quite hear you. So you said, if I understood you well, so you've talked about positive examples, but aren't there also very many negative outcomes of this kind of diversity, where people confronted by otherness are not embracing that otherness or integrating that otherness, but strongly reject it? Am I paraphrasing you well enough here?
My question was more of, I don't know what's like, but like, I was more asking, like, if you know an example of what you shared with us, so using language to include, if you know of other examples where language and different languages and diversity has been used to exclude, so the other way around.
Can you hear me?
No.
Now, yes.
Now,
okay. Yes. Okay. So yeah, I think actually that's very interesting, because language is our primary tool to communicate, right? That's humans. That's our first tool that we go to if we want to communicate with other humans. But the interesting thing, of course, is that we can also use language to exclude other people, and to do the opposite of what language is actually meant for, to communicate. So I can very deliberately, if I'm a Dutch person and I work at a Dutch workplace, but there are some internationals working there, and I don't like the fact that my workplace is becoming more and more international, I can very deliberately speak Dutch with my colleagues to exclude them. And I think that's actually very, very interesting. And the same with culture, of course. Certain cultural gestures enable me to communicate with you, because we belong more or less to the same culture, the Western culture, if you like. but are really unintelligible to anybody not so familiar with that culture. So language and culture are ideal tools to communicate and to create bonds between people, but they're also ideal tools to do the exact opposite. I think that's very interesting, and I think it's very interesting also that there hasn't been even more research on that, because if you look, for instance, at the field of studies that does a lot of research on these topics, intercultural communication, that's a field of studies that really engages with these kind of issues. They're mostly looking at, okay, so communication breakdowns, how do they happen? But there's this kind of assumption that people most of the time do want to communicate, whereas I think actually we've seen a lot of examples recently, and not so recently, but increasingly, I would say, where people use language and culture to exclude each other and to deliberately not communicate. And wonderful topic that would be very interesting to explore a bit more. Yeah. Doesn't really answer your question, but just saying that what you're raising here is really interesting, and something that wonderful to explore, and I hope to explore a bit more myself also. These deliberate moments of communication breakdown.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand the topic of your research. So I mentioned there are
Yeah.
Right to.
All right, thank you very much in that case. I'm just going to read out the first question in the chat for the people on the live stream to be aware of what's going on. We have a question that reads, you focus mostly on the Dutch and Arabic languages with some Chinese in between, but given more time, would you also use other or more languages to make comparisons?
Yeah, and Frisian, let's not forget Frisian, because I also use that, and given time, that's actually an example that I would love to explore a bit more in a lecture like this, and also in my future research. I remember, for instance, in my childhood, that people could get really angry if in the train two Frisians would be speaking Frisian with each other. And there was a lot of kind of negative attitudes towards that. Now, I would argue that has changed. But I've also been told by Frisian friends that it hasn't completely changed, and that there is still kind of this strong negative attitude to people, Dutch people, feeling that Frisians are kind of shoving their own being different into other people's faces when they decide to speak Frisian. And I think that's very strange, of course, because it's the second national language of the official national language of the Netherlands. So the idea that you would disagree with that being spoken on the street, that's something that and in general, we talked about how the Arabic sign would have these connotations for you. It's negative, and for a lot of Dutch people, kind of negative connotations, unfortunately, of course. And I have a colleague who maybe you should also invite one day to give a lecture, but she does a lot of research on when people hear a certain dialect or accent or another language like Frisian, why they respond in a certain way, and the kind of stereotypes they also have. So if we hear, for instance, in the Netherlands, somebody who speaks Gronings, a lot of people will have negative stereotypes about kind of backwardness, rural kind of farming associations, negative things like that. But that becomes more than stereotype research. And you can actually do these kind of brain scans and see which areas of the brain are then activated if we hear these different languages, and our attitudes that are activated by being confronted with these different languages. So yeah, that's something I pick up in my own research, and I do that more from the cultural side. So for instance, I look at I've published one article on people who come from a very strict Christian background, who grow up in these kind of very confined Christian villages where they don't meet anybody from outside their own very specific form of Christianity. A Dutch Reformed Liberated, as it's called, for those of you who speak Dutch, gereformeerd artikel 31. And are then, when they grow up and they become a little bit older, and they are suddenly confronted with people who are not Christian like that. And what that does with them is what I call a border experience. A border experience is a moment where you're suddenly confronted with a way of being that is different from your own way of being. And by being confronted with this way of being that is different from your own way of being, you suddenly become aware of who you are. And you might start to question who you are. Or you might start to reinforce who you are. So there's different responses, of course, that are possible here. Do you become more Christian if that happens to you, or do you become less Christian when that happens to you? More Dutch or less Dutch? I hope that answers your question a little bit.
I hope so too. If not, feel free to just send a follow-up in the chat or the. Oh, I see a thumbs up. Yeah, we had some people who agreed. One person was describing their experience that that they were surrounded by people speaking Gronings when they first arrived. And yeah, Lucy also said, this reminds me of the Swedish spoken in the South, which sounds more familiar to Danish, which isn't looked upon all that friendly, so they really make a difference based on dialect. Then we have a question from Siska about the Christian community you just mentioned. Do you have a link to the report you made about people who are strictly Christian? And that's somewhere.
Yeah, if you Google my name, you'll find either my personal website or my page at the University of Groningen's website, and it's an article called "To Leave Your Father and Your Kindred's Place." To leave your father and your kindred's place. That's a quotation from the Bible. And otherwise, just send me an email and I'll send you the link. I wrote it together with Krina Huisman, a colleague of mine.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any further questions?
There's somebody in the chat, I saw that, I mentioned one of my other colleagues, Vincent Boswijk. So he's actually part of our program, and I've taught together with him. Wonderful PhD research Vincent Boswijk has about indeed how people perceive when they hear spoken Frisian, what the attitudes are then towards that. And he does that. He's a PhD that's the Minorities in Multilingualism program. Somebody asks which program this is. It's the Minorities in Multilingualism program. And his supervisor, Vincent Boswijk's supervisor, is Hanneke Loerts, and that's the other person that I just mentioned. So who does this kind of brain research? So what kind of stereotypes are activated when people hear a certain accent? And do they look up to certain accents? Like people speak a certain variety of Dutch. Does that make other people admire them? I myself speak this kind of standard Dutch, and people would often before compliment me on oh, your Dutch sounds so beautiful. But what they actually meant was it sounds like the standard Dutch that we heard on television. And I've always regretted the fact that I don't speak a dialect or an accent myself, and that I can only speak that standard version that everybody else also can speak.
Do you think that this tolerance towards languages that aren't our own has kind of improved with the world becoming more multilingual, so more and more people that learn at least English as their second language, or even more than that?
Well, yes and no, actually. So it's not so clear cut, because when I was young and I grew up, you would have people from Belgium speaking on Dutch television, and they would just speak their own variety of a standard Dutch, which is Southern Standard Dutch. And that would be okay, and we would just communicate with each other. And nowadays, they feel the need to subtitle that. So if you look at kind of the tolerance that people have for that, I would say that there's an instance where it has diminished. Of course, on the other hand, nowadays on Dutch television, you will hear maybe a weatherman speaking with a very strong Frisian accent, and that's okay. Whereas before that would not be perceivable, and especially also in the UK, the BBC before, it all has to be received pronunciation, and now somebody with a Scottish accent, Southern English accent, or Northern English accent, all of that is fine. But so yeah, it's not as clear cut as you say, and I would also say that tolerance towards languages, or tolerance towards certain languages. So French is a romantic language, right? It's a langue d'amour, and Spanish is a fiery language, but Arabic is something that a lot of people then would have negative connotation, unfortunately, with. So yeah, it really depends, I think, on these stereotypes that people have on certain prejudices that people have, whether they are willing to tolerate another language or not. And globalization has, of course, influenced how we do that, because we know more about languages than we knew before. But I would also argue that the border experience that we have when we hear somebody speak English is a far smaller border experience for Dutch people, at least, than when we hear Arabic or Turkish being spoken. And thereby our tolerance will also be smaller. There's a lot of people. Can you just read some of the questions in the chat, because there's a lot of comments. So I'm going to leave you to create. I myself have no chat box next to it, so.
I will try my best. Yeah, and someone commented on what you just said, that they noticed that different accents are subtitled in movies now more than before. So that would support that perspective.
On the other hand, my daughter, I've got a 6-year-old daughter, and she watches My Little Pony, which is a marvelous program, I would say. But I've noticed that they have both Belgian Dutch and Dutch in that program, and there's no subtitles there. And I think that's wonderful, because that means that children nowadays, and of course it's a financial thing, right? For Netflix, by doing that, they don't have to synchronize twice. They don't have to dub it twice. They only have to do it once for the Netherlands and Flanders. But they would also have to then use both accents. But the effect of that, this kind of financial decision, this economic decision, is that children will become more tolerant towards different varieties of Dutch.
That's a nice example. I'm really sorry for this microphone disturbance, by the way. It might be me. There's a question. Do you think there could be a language, let's say emojis, that can be understood without a reduction in meaning across multiple cultures?
Yeah, you can hear me now. Yes, it's wonderful. Another program that I would recommend you all to watch is Doctor Who. And there's an episode in Doctor Who where they travel to the far future, and there's these robots who don't speak language, they speak emoji. And the idea, of course, is two things: that it's a universal language, that emoji is a universal language, first of all, and second of all, that it's so universal that it's here to stay. I think this is something like thousands of years in the future, and these robots will still communicate by speaking emoji. But I love that, and there's lots of interesting research actually on how people use emoji. The funny thing, of course, is that your use of emoji can be very culturally defined. So a lot of our emojis, most of them, all of them, are originally come from Japan, where they're often used in completely different ways than we use them. And so, for instance, the emoji with a little drop here, a lot of Dutch people use them to show, oh, I'm crying a little bit, I'm a little bit sad. But the drop is actually a sweat drop, and it says, oh, I'm feeling anxious, you know. So there's a lot of cultural misunderstanding around emojis as well. And the way you use an emoji might actually betray the culture that you come from, rather than being something cross-cultural.
All right, thank you very much. Then we have a question. Would you recommend the Dutch society to adopt more multilingual road signs, public transport announcements, etc.?
Thank you, because that also gives me the opportunity to correct a mistake I made during this lecture. Because I said that the signs that I showed at the beginning, the Chinese sign, the Frisian sign, and the Arabic sign, I said that the first two were put there by the authorities, whereas the third one wasn't. But the second was actually also not put there by the authorities, but by an action group that felt that there should be more Frisian in Friesland, the province of Friesland. And they removed the Dutch sign and they replaced it with the Frisian sign. And it's an action group that does that sometimes. And then, of course, they don't put the Dutch signs back, because that would upset a lot of people as well. So I think there's one. I think yes. I think there should be more multilingual signs, at least in Friesland, because it's the language there, and I think it's quite. I think there should be more Frisian signs in Friesland. And then somebody says that people from Leeuwarden generally hate Frisian culture. So there you have another battleground. But this is just my personal opinion. I think there should be more Frisian signs. I used to work for the municipality of Amsterdam, And I worked for an information center in Amsterdam West, which is the part of Amsterdam West outside the ringway around Amsterdam. So the less nice part, a lot of people would say. And there was a lot of discussion at the time when I worked there whether we should have information in Arabic and Turkish, because a lot of people living in Amsterdam West, for them that's the language that they might be more familiar with or as familiar with as with Dutch. I don't have strong opinions about it, because I feel that if you decide to communicate in more languages than just Dutch, the question then becomes which language, and that inevitably will also lead to a battleground. And what you also saw is that when people started to communicate in Turkish, they would actually offend Turkish people because they wouldn't do it right, and they would put the dots on the wrong letters and things like that. And with Arabic, I mean, hardly anybody who comes from an Arabic country grows up with the standard Arabic that you would use when you communicate with people in Arabic. So that's and people from with an Amazigh background, a Berber background, would feel excluded by that and would actually might be angered by that. But I do think it's nice, for instance, if you have a place like Chinatown, that you put up a sign with Chinese letters. I think that's just nice. It shows a kind of inclusiveness. It's not about whether people are then better able to read the signs, because they're probably just as good as reading the Dutch sign as the Chinese sign. But it's just nice, right? It kind of shows that you acknowledge, as authorities, that you acknowledge the diversity and that you value the diversity rather than see it as a problem. So in that sense, yes, I think it would actually be really nice in neighborhoods that are quite diverse to kind of show the extent to which you value the diversity of the neighborhood, and the extent also to which you would say everybody is, think of that exhibition, the Noord exhibition, where they say, well, a kebab place is as Dutch, if it is in the Netherlands, if it is in Amsterdam North, it is as Dutch as bitterballen. And I think by putting up bilingual signs, that's one way of showing that to people. I'm thinking also of a colleague of mine who does research on multilingual education, and she does research on trilingual schools in Friesland, where people, where the children speak in 3 languages and they learn 3 languages: Frisian, English, and Dutch. And one day they will speak Frisian, the other day they will speak English, and the other day they will speak Dutch. So it's kind of divided like that. And recently, what they started to do is, because there were a lot of immigrants from Poland and Syrian refugees, they started to acknowledge that those languages existed as well. So they would start the day by saying, "Hello, everybody, welcome," in all the languages that they knew. So it was Frisian, English. Joanna, that's Joanna Duarte, a good colleague of mine, wonderful research she does on multilingual education. And you actually should have asked her to give this lecture, but I was too eager to do it. And then so they would do it in English, they would do it in Frisian, they would do it in Dutch, and then they would invite the Polish boy to say it in Polish, and they would invite the Syrian girl to say it in Arabic, in Syrian Arabic. And I think what you do by doing that is you kind of show these people you are as welcome as everybody else. Okay, your language is not as kind of prevalent as the other languages here, but if anything that you can contribute in your language is valued and is welcome. And I think that is much more also for these people to feel at home, these children to feel included. It's much better to do that than what happened when I was a child, where 2 girls who were sitting behind me, both of them came from the Dutch Antilles, were told by the teacher that they were not allowed, when they would speak Papiamento with each other, that they shouldn't speak Papiamento with each other. Because the idea, not because the teacher was an evil bastard, but because he wanted to help these girls, and he thought he was helping them by saying, "Who speak Dutch, don't speak Papiamento because you're excluding yourself from this group." But I think in the end, these girls would actually feel excluded because they were told not to speak Papiamento. And this way that it's done in these schools, kind of by inviting the people to say, "Oh, how do you say that then, Papiamento?" is in the long run much more effective, and will have them feel much more at home, and thereby also more willing to contribute to Dutch society than by just trying to shut it down.
Thank you very much for that. We have a question that fits quite well with this, I think. Why do you think that we have more problems with some languages to integrate while others are easier?
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but if the question is why do we have more problems with some languages than others, then I would say the answer is that we just have these. I mean, somebody speaks Arabic, we feel, oh, you know, Arabic is Islam. Islam is a threat to Western society. We don't want that here. So there's just certain stereotypes or prejudices that we connect with certain languages, which might also lead to the extent to which we are willing to integrate those languages into Dutch society. So I'm not sure whether that answers the question. Another way to look at it would be, but I wouldn't agree with that. It would be saying, well, some languages are just further away from Dutch. So German is closer to Dutch, so it will be easier to kind of have people speak German in the Netherlands because, you know, they're not as strange and it's easier to understand. But again, I'm not sure whether I understand the question.
Okay, maybe if there's a follow-up or...
I saw a follow-up question actually coming by saying because some people don't integrate as well. So that would actually be tying the language to the culture and saying, well, some people from certain cultural backgrounds integrate less well into Dutch society. Whereas other people integrate better into Dutch society, and therefore we are also more willing to kind of tolerate their languages and have them. So the idea then is that yes, we can accept a road sign in Chinese in Chinatown because the Chinese are better integrated into Dutch society than that people with a Moroccan background are integrated into society. Funny thing though is that research shows that that's not true. That the Moroccans are actually one of the most integrated people in Dutch society in the sense that they will speak Dutch with each other rather than Moroccan if they are outside and all these kind of things. So I can't quote the exact research, but research has shown that actually one of the problems with the Moroccan minority in the Netherlands is that they are so well integrated, whereby also their differences become more prevalent because they start asking for a certain space for themselves as well. So, and then somebody asks, why are you speaking about Moroccans? Where are Moroccan professors in? But I can't read it. Can you read that for me? That one remark?
Yes, I think it consists of kind of two questions. The first thing is, do we want language to integrate? Then Dutch disappears, and then what happens? And then the second part is, why are you speaking for Moroccans? Where are they as professors at universities? I'm not quite sure if I understood.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say I don't know whether the number of professors at university is a sign of how well how well a group is integrated in society. On the other hand, I'm willing to introduce you to several of my friends who are Moroccan professors at Dutch universities. I mean, professors with a Moroccan background at Dutch universities. There are also far more, for instance, Dutch writers with a Moroccan background than a lot of other minorities. And so you could also say that as a sign of integration. Again, I don't know what your measure for integration is. Unfortunately, I also cannot quote from this research by heart. Yes, women Moroccan professors even. Can you imagine? Somebody says, are there women Moroccan professors? Yes, I can also introduce you to them if you want to. If you point out one, then she is a token. Well, yes, but I can point out several. I'm not sure whether I want to have this discussion in this way, but do you want to say something? Okay. Oh, I thought BEF is like a bad SF. I thought it was actually kind of internet language. Not a typo. But I'm not sure which discussion we are having here. I'm also not quite sure which questions I'm answering here. So maybe you can restate the question.
No,
When I hear about diversity, then it is kind of psychology. Sorry.
I just want to make sure the first question was about the language that we have more or less integrated came from me, and it was exactly like, why do you think, like the idea was, why do you think we allow Chinese signs in Chinatown, but we don't allow street signs in Arabic in the Netherlands, although the two cultures are pretty different from ours in general, and they have, but one is more tolerated in the Netherlands while the other one is less tolerated. That was my question in general, but then it escalated in something different. I don't know what it is now.
That's okay. I'm fine with the discussion. I think it's a very good and interesting discussion. But I think that particular example that you're giving, I can only repeat myself again. I'm just saying people have certain stereotypes when they think about Chinese, and they have certain stereotypes when they think about Arabs. And the stereotypes that they have when they think about Arabs are apparently preventing Arabic street signs in the Netherlands, because Arabic is often conflated with Islamic, which is often seen as something that we don't really want too much of in Dutch society, and therefore we will be less willing to accept Arabic street signs than we are to accept Chinese street signs. So beyond that, I don't have an answer. And then the discussion went to, okay, but, and I made a remark. I said, actually, Moroccans are quite well integrated, research has shown that. And then there were certain questions kind of questioning how integrated the Moroccans are. But in that case, I can only just say, well, you know, there's research available on that by people who are more able to answer that question to me. And then there were certain people as well, show me a Moroccan university professor. And then I said, well, there's plenty of them actually. And beyond that, I don't think I have anything to contribute to that discussion. I think the problem, of course, always with minorities in a country is, or problem, but I mean, the issue with minorities always is, and this is a sociological analysis that then, you know, you also enter, is often a minority will be in a disenfranchised position, right? Because of more poverty among them, more less access to networks, all those kind of things, which obviously also will make it more difficult for you if you belong to that minority to find yourself represented in education, to find yourself represented in the media, to find yourself represented basically anywhere. So then it becomes a circle, right? Yes, there are less Moroccan professors percentage-wise, or Turkish, or to use any Frisian probably as well, percentage-wise than other people. But what does that actually mean? And what is the analysis that we can make? Does it mean that they're less integrated, or does it mean, what do you mean by integration? How do you measure integration? And I'm not assuming I have answers to that. I'm also not saying that we should, right? I'm not necessarily taking a position in this debate. I do find it very interesting why people have certain attitudes towards certain cultures and other attitudes toward other cultures.
All right, thank you very much. We also see a role of, you of course now mentioned a variety of art projects that kind of try to bridge this gap between different cultures. You also see a role in media, a role of media to kind of be more engaged towards bridging that gap.
Well, I mean, art doesn't reach a lot of people, right? I'm pretty sure that nobody ever heard of these artworks before, but the moment I started mentioning My Little Pony and Doctor Who, I think I got a lot more recognition. So you could definitely make the argument that if you want to achieve something, better to use those media tools than artworks. Although you can still go to the Design Museum in Arnhem and see the Albert Heijn Mosque. It has become part of the permanent exhibition there, and I would encourage you to go there. It's a wonderful exhibit. here's a dilemma that you always have, right? Because as a university professor, as somebody doing research, you're slightly outside the society that you're doing research on. But of course you're not, you're fully part of it. Which also means that you have opinions about it. And that you feel that it should be done in this way, and that it should be done in that way. I think if I look at my body of research, I would say that one thing that helps is to start seeing diversity not necessarily as a problem, but as just something that you experience, that you go through, and to start recognizing your own border experiences, to start kind of questioning your own border experiences. But then I also realized I talk from a very privileged position, where I'm in the privileged position to be able to do that, and the luxury to do that. Apparently, I feel so safe where I am that I can start discussing my own border experiences and say, well, maybe I should be a bit more open to other cultures, etc., which is a privilege that might not be available to everybody. Unfortunately, I don't really have answers, right? I can ask a lot of questions, and I can point at artworks and say, oh, they ask very interesting questions. But the more and more I do this research, the less and less kind of definitive answers I have. But I do think it starts with kind of opening a debate, kind of start listening to other people, even if they have opinions that might be not so close to your own opinions. So maybe somebody has a good argument why we shouldn't have Chinese signs in Chinatown in the Netherlands. And I would actually also be very interested to hear that argument. Maybe I'm not always able, this is a border experience for myself, so I start kind of shutting down because I know. But I think it does start with listening, and it does start to kind of hear those arguments. And then as a scholar, as a scientist, also start analyzing them. Where did they come from? Maybe hook up people to these brain scans and kind of look at, okay, but what happens in the brain? And when people say, yes, I'm willing to have a border experience, and I find it very interesting, and I find it, when I see Arabic science, I think of good food, and that's an experience, right? Good foods, sandy deserts, beautiful sunsets. Or no, I see bearded men with swords coming for me with the Quran in one hand and the sword in another hand, to just use some very blatant, terrible stereotypes. So there's two things that you can do, right? On the one hand, just listening. On the other hand, say, well, as a scholar, I also have the tools to analyze them and to maybe get to the heart of the matter a little bit. And art does that in one way. Media maybe can try to build bridges, and scholars and scientists can just analyze what is going on and offer that analysis.
All right, thank you very much. I think that served as a very nice concluding remark to this discussion. Unless we have any other questions that I am overlooking right now. There was a question asked about having a different link to the research that Dr. Munander published. We can also just publish a link to that in the Facebook and website event. Then you can check there again, and it will be available for you, if that helps.
Or just, again, go to my page at the university website, because all my publications are available there. You can actually download it from there. Oh, there it is. Wonderful. Somebody posted it already. That's amazing.
All right, there we go.
That was a really great research for me to do, because it was so different from what I normally do. Normally I work indeed with representations of Muslims and things like that. And this was wonderful to do something on this Dutch Christian group in the Netherlands. It made me also kind of completely reconsider what it means to be Dutch and what it means to live in a diverse society, because we tend to kind of link diversity with contemporary society, saying, oh, this is new. This came with migrants coming from Turkey, coming from Morocco. But then when you look at the past of the Netherlands, you see that it's always been very diverse, with people speaking Gronings and Frisian, with people belonging to these kind of different Christian denominations. And the argument that I make in that article is actually, we want to learn how to deal with today's diversity. Maybe we should have a look at the diversity that has always been here in the Netherlands, and the fact that the Netherlands has always been an extremely diverse society in that sense.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this lecture has given a lot of inspiration for future movies to watch, series to watch, or articles to read. So thank you very much for that. And thank you also to everybody who asked questions and contributed to the discussion. I think that was very, very interesting. And thank you, of course, once again to Dr. Munander for joining us tonight and facilitating this very informative lecture and discussion. So maybe we
Thank you
can
very
do
much.
another round of virtual applause.